So you're a native
I am.
to Sona. Tell
Yes.
us about that.
Well, my parents met here in 1925, and I'm the youngest of 5 children, all born at St. Mary's Hospital on the west side, which at the time was the only hospital in town. And my dad, his parents were immigrants from Ireland to New York City, and his mother was diagnosed with tuberculosis, so it was suggested that they move to dry and sunny Arizona. So they came out here in 1912. My mother came from southern Illinois and had chronic sinus problems, and her doctor told her that it would be wise for her to move to dry, sunny Arizona. So she came out here in 1925 by rail with no air conditioners in the cars for the railroad. And my parents met at a young adults group at church.
Tell us about your childhood growing up.
Well, probably wasn't any different than any other person's childhood. However, my dad was not a farmer, so he had to go to work every day. And he had to go to work whether they lived in town or lived on the homestead or whatever. He was an accountant. And Mom stayed home with us. And then some, because my older brothers drove her nuts.
You said homestead, but he was an accountant. Mm-hmm. How did those two occupations mix?
Just fine, except Dad drove into town every day and put a lot of miles on the cars and a lot of miles on the tires and wore out cars. My oldest brother told me he went through 4 cars while they lived out there.
Explain the concept of homesteading and proving up.
Well, there are laws about homesteading, and they had to file a claim. All homesteaders had to file a claim for the land that they wanted to live on. And they had to be able to live on that land for a certain amount of time. I think the minimum was 3 years. Mom and Dad, Mother would have lived out there forever. But the older boys had to go to school, and the school bus driver was not reliable at all. So they had to move into town to get the kids into school.
So did your father work on the land as well?
No. He was not good with his hands as far as physical labor. So he was an accountant. He drove into his practice every day, and they paid cash for the improvements to the land.
And your mother did what?
Basically, she turned out to be a good educator to my older brothers. She'd take them on what we'd call field trips today. They just would take a walk every day, and she had learned all the names of all the plants and all the animals on the desert, and she taught the boys what the names were, both Latin and English, and the kids grew up knowing what to call all these plants and animals. And one thing she did notice, there was quite a lot of rattlesnakes. Pardon me for that. And one of the neighbors that lived down the street from him on his own homestead taught Mom how to skin the snakes and then take the vertebrae out of them and make the vertebrae into necklaces. And you can see that I have on one of her necklaces today. Now, when she did this, it was fine and it was legal. But because so many people caught the snakes and all the other desert habitats, that catching and killing rattlesnakes became illegal. So unless you own the land that the snakes are on, you can't touch them.
So she found these snakes on your land?
On her land, and she met some other people up in that area. There was 2 boys that lived near Oracle, and they went out hunting, and they brought her snakes every week. So she didn't have to go hunting for them all the time.
And she had an agreement with the VA hospital?
Yeah, yeah. She took the snakes and the skins, basically, to the VA hospital, and the veterans made dresses, jackets, belts, buckles, boots, among other things. And then Mom sold those. She didn't know how to sew either, but that's okay.
But she cooked and cleaned and hunted for rattlesnakes. Okay.
And when she got really, really busy with the business, they had a lady who was down on her luck, and that lady came and lived with them and watched the kids and did the cooking and the cleaning. And I have pictures of the house for you, and the house was small, didn't take a lot of cleaning.
I understand your father had something to do with La Cholla Boulevard.
He did. And you have to remember everything I'm telling you, I heard in stories while both Mom and Dad were alive. And Dad's been gone 40 years, Mother's been gone 22 years. But Dad and some of the other neighbors wanted to be able to drive into town on what became La Jolla Boulevard. But at the time they lived up there, it was a trail. So while Dad was in town, he talked to the Pima County Supervisor of Transportation and asked if there was any way they could get that road cut through. And the man said, if you can get the road cleared, we'll bring the bulldozers up and take it down to bare dirt, and then you'll have a dirt road to drive on.
So the road went from where to where?
At that time, it went from Moore Road south to McGee Road. Before that, it was a trail that went north on McGee, and yes, you did have to cross the CDO wash. So, and there are several other washes on that road too that weren't bridged for years and years and years. And then sometime after that, McGee was run north, and I've never driven it all the way north, so I don't know how far north it goes.
How are you and your siblings involved in our community?
Well, basically, by our community, you mean Oro Valley, right? The whole family was very involved in the city of Tucson. But of course, Oro Valley didn't become Oro Valley until 1974. And after 74, my husband and I moved from where we were living to up here. I had a job teaching for the Marana School District, and I taught at Marana High School for 5 years. And that was a 25-mile drive one way to go to work. And when we moved up here, it was a 4-mile drive.
And how did you and Dick meet?
Oh, how much time do you have? Dick was in the Air Force at the time. He was a second lieutenant, and his brother was in town visiting. He had gone to OTS also, Officer Training School. And Dick and his brother were out playing miniature golf one Saturday evening at the miniature golf place on Speedway. And Dick's, Dan, my second oldest brother, who had 6 children, he and his family were out playing miniature golf. And Dick had his Phi Kappa Theta sweatshirt on, which was their fraternity. Well, it's the fraternity for Catholic men. And Dan saw the emblem from the fraternity and automatically knew that Dick was Catholic, and they got to talking. And after a while, Dan said, well, I have 2 single sisters if you're interested in meeting them. And so he gave them our phone number, and the next day they called and they came over, and a whole bunch of us from the Catholic Student Center on campus went swimming at the Ramada Inn. And I left my bathing cap in Dick's car, and he called the next day to get it back to me, and that was 57 years ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
As long as we're talking about Dick, he was on the Oro Valley Town Council, vice mayor, and interim mayor. How did his involvement in the town affect your involvement?
Well, while I was working, it didn't much, because teaching high school keeps a person busy, and I mean very busy. And once I retired, then I had time to get involved. And about the same time that the council was deciding whether or not they should condemn this land so it could be bladed, Dick mentioned it to me, and I said, we can't let them do that. That's a historic property. And so I don't remember all the details from it, but the council stopped it. And thus we have the ranch today owned by Oro Valley.
You're the youngest of 5 children. Tell me about your siblings.
Okay, my oldest brother was 14 years older than me. As I said before, we were all born here. We all grew up here. Tucson High School, which was the only high school in Tucson in those days. A second brother was Dan. He was the one, they eventually had 6 children. And when they would come to Grandma's house where I still lived, we called them what do we call them? Remember, Dick? They weren't the brats, but the name was close to it. But, you know, they were noisy, rambunctious kids. The 6 children were born in about 8 years. So it was very confusing when they were there. My third brother was born 5 years later, was a very quiet person. Jim got a degree in accounting, Dan got a degree in accounting, Pat got a degree in accounting, all from the University of Arizona. And the nice thing was when Dan and Pat took the test to get his certificate as a CPA, Dad was the president of the State Society of Certified Public Accountants, and he got to sign both of my brothers' certificates. Pat had a practice here in town for many years, and he worked for my dad, and then when it was time for Dad to retire, Pat and another man about his age bought Dad out. And about that same time, Mom and Dad sold the homestead. They had built the homestead up to a size of 720 acres. So didn't all touch each other, but according to the laws of Arizona, if you touched another homestead on one side, if the people wanted out of the homestead, the adjoining neighbors could bid on it. And so they ended up, because they started with 40 acres. My sister was born 5 years later, and Kathy, she's Kathy McCall now, married a young man who got his degree from the U of A, and they had 3 children. My sister worked for my dad for many years, and then she worked for the Diocese of Arizona for many years. And then there's me. Next.
The youngest one.
Yeah, I'm the youngest.
So what is your vision for the Oro Valley Historical Society?
To preserve our history, and we've started very well. We have the Pushes that built Steam Pump Ranch, or CDO Ranch as it was originally called, the ranch went down through the family, and then the Proctors bought it after a while. And Mr. Zip was one of, Henry Zip was one of the children, or no, he was a child of the Pushes. And he gave all the belongings, all the photographs, all the documents, all the way back to the Historical Society. And we can't let that go to waste. And our committee chair of setting up displays, we use the Push House now as a museum, and the people who set up the displays use all of Push's documents, and depending on what the theme is, they use outside sources too.
You say theme of what?
Well, anything that has to do with history. Generally speaking, though, they concentrate on local history. Like just recently, we had a theme of Native American communities surround us here. And there are so many tribes of Native American communities, and every room in here had represented a different tribe. I don't know how many there are, but I think it's over 20.